I don't want to scare anyone, but the movie Mad Max, where fuel was so precious and expensive that people were killing one another over it, was set in 2021.
I ever gone into the supermarket and found that the prices are increasing all the time? There's shortages everywhere. Have you got that feeling? You're not alone.
I bet you are going to talk about this stamp.
I don't know where he came from, but he's right. Stay tuned for this episode of... Let's go back a few years, about 100 years. Let's go back to 1922, 1923 to be exact, 100 years ago, when inflation was a real thing. World War I ended and the Treaty of Versailles was signed. France and Belgium really wanted to have it in for Germany. And they signed, the treaty was forced onto Germany, and with many clauses that the proud Germans did not like. One of the clauses was that Germany had bore full responsibility for the war. It was the War Guilt Clause. Clause 241 put the blame squarely on the shoulders of the Germans. And that, in my opinion, was one of the causes of the Second World War, which broke out barely 20 years later. Now, one of the things, and that's basically the story of today, is that the Germans were forced to pay reparations. As part of the reparations that was signed, Germany was supposed to pay 132 billion Reichsmarks. That is a huge amount of money. And no one knew how Germany was ever going to repay it. The 1921 London schedule of payments as a result of the Versailles Treaty set out a schedule for Germany to repay. Germany defaulted on the second payment, which is set in 1922. She claimed that was all they had, nothing left. The French didn't believe her, the Belgians didn't believe her, and as such they sent troops into the Ruhr Valley, where most of Germany's industry was. And this was the start of a problem. They had occupied the railways, the mines and many factories, and basically anything that Germany had which could help them pay the reparations. The Germans, on the other hand, came out and told the workers not to abide by these occupiers, these invaders, what should we say. Now, at the same time these people were sitting home and not getting paid, there was also no income because the area was occupied. So there's no income and they were still forking out money. One would say that that inflation that the writing was on the wall, did it? And inflation started. Let's take an example. A dozen eggs in 1918 cost half a Reichsmark. In 1921, it became 3 Reichsmarks. In 1923, it reached 500 Reichsmarks. But that was only in January. By September, it had already reached 30 million. Can you imagine that? 500 to 30 million? Now, don't forget, salaries didn't increase at the same time. How could you pay that kind of money? Inflation increased, but because we're talking about stamps here, not only did the cost of eggs increase, but also the price of postage. Inflation grew all throughout 1923, and they printed postage stamps designed and printed, and it came to the stage by August 1923, where because of the inflation was increasing so much, instead of printing new stamps, they started overprinting the stamps with new values. Here's some examples. Let's take an example of a simple letter to send locally in 1923. Not registered, not anyway, but locally. On the 1st of March, it was 40 marks. August, it went to 400 marks. That's 10 times as much in a few months. Already by the 24th of August, it came to 8,000 marks. 1st of October, it got to 800,000 marks. In October, there were 3 rate changes. 1st of October, 800,000 marks. The 10th of October, 2 million marks. And the 20th of October, 4 million marks. In November, it's got steadily worse. There were 5 rate changes. 40 million marks to 4 billion marks. It's like paper was meaningless. The stamps were actually meaningless. In many, many cases, people did not have that kind of cash. So they went into the post offices and paid with cash, and it was simply written on the letter that they'd paid, or whatever the rate was, 50 million, 50 billion, or whatever it was. They just wrote down, sometimes just PD. It was the postal worker who wrote down. Some they just wrote down and scribbled, say, 5 million on the letter, and that was enough. It was just, everything was topsy-turvy. As I told you before, there were 5 postal rate changes during the month of November itself. Now, when at one stage, the 1 trillion marks was only valued at $1. People walked around with wheelbarrows of money to pay for things. When the 1,000 billion banknote came out, people didn't even bother to get the change. They had no value. People lost their savings. It turns out that a pension at that time could only buy you a cup of coffee. But when you have 5 rate changes in the middle of a month and you've had 10 billion stamped, the post office didn't have money to print and overprint new stamps. So someone came up with an idea. He said, we will quadruple the face value of the stamp. So in other words, this 10 billion stamp all of a sudden became worth 40 billion. So you went to the post office and they said to you, okay, you have to pay 40 billion marks, and they put on a 10 billion stamp. The currency had no value whatsoever. Eventually things started coming right in the 1st of December. There was a new head of the Reichsbank, and he started floating the idea of a new bank, a new currency. This was not his own idea. It was floated already in August, but he implemented it. And they chopped off 9 zeros off the mark and called it a renter mark. Things really got right started coming right in December, but Germany still had a problem. People were not getting married because they couldn't afford to get married, and the country was in a real problem. The time is right for a change. Now along comes a person, Adolf Hitler, who was a veteran of World War I, or the Great Wars they called in those days, and he started talking. And this guy was a charismatic speaker, and people loved to listen to him. They also loved to listen to him because he basically blamed the Jews on everything. Similar to today, if you hear what's going on all over the world. People blame Jews for this and for that and whatever. And he basically said that the Weimar Republic was to blame for all of the Germany's problems. And don't forget, we talk about 1923 when he started a big rise to power. And he blamed it on, he said that all the finances of the Weimar Republic were Jews, and he also hated communism, and Karl Marx was a Jew. And this actually appealed to people's ears. It's easy to blame someone else for their own problems. And slowly, he got more and more followers. And in November of 1923, while all the hyperinflation was going on, he tried to take over in his famous Munich Putsch. He, of course, was arrested, sent to jail, wrote a book called Mein Kampf, His Struggle, and I'm not going to talk more about Hitler at this day. Before we sign off, I just want to show you 2 interesting covers.
This letter was sent on the 1st of October 1923. Within Germany. The regular postage rate from the 1st of October was 2 million marks. Registration was another 2 million marks. The stamps used make up 4 million plus 50,000 marks, but the 50,000 marks had absolutely no value. So no one really cared. $1 was valued in the millions of marks, so what is 50,000?
Now, this one is even more interesting. It was sent on the 12th of November 1923. The regular postage rate from that day was 10 billion marks. A huge amount of money. Not only was it the first day of the new rate, but it was also the first day of the new 10 billion mark stamp. Registration was another 10 million marks. but there is no registration label. That is because the letter was insured and this was the handling fee. The sender insured this for 2,520 billion marks. The fee was 2% of that, which was 50,400 million marks. Can you imagine those sums?
Anyway, people, that's the story of this stamp. Thank you very much for listening to me, and see you next time. Bye.